There's a box in the closet under my basement stairs. You know, the one with a little triangle door? I haven't opened it for 10 years, but I know what's inside. I feel it pulse like a sore muscle each time I walk by, to do laundry, to get the mop. The things inside that box could burn down with this house, and I would still feel it.
F-O-N-D-S. It's a Canadian term. It is the idea of, I throw out stuff every day, but what is the stuff that I keep and that I put aside for some future use or for remembrance and so it's that material that's sort of been put aside, and that's sort of what remains. That's what we call the foam, this sort of organic accumulation of documentary evidence that remains in somebody's life.
Running through the field with stockings in your hand, summer was new and so were you. Your golden hair was flowing like the weeping willow will. There were Josie playing checkers at the gym when I dream about.
I'm Carmel Michael, and this is Hyacinth Podcast, where together with scholars, writers, and artists, I ponder beauty, anger, love, loss, fear, glory, and the unbreakable heart of human living. In this episode, we go inside the vault at the Queen's University Archives with archivist Heather Home, and I speak with scholars Dr. Kristin Moriah and Dr. Mark Campbell, whose research takes them into the archives as well, but asks important questions about what is missing there. And I ask you to come along as I finally get the courage to open that box and unearth a very personal kind of family archive.
But we all kind of have archives. I think specifically about photographs in this way and how important family photographs become to people. So I think that we all have close encounters with the archives and experiences around collecting what has been significant for us and what represents your own sort of histories and priorities, sort of no matter who you are.
I am thinking about personal collections. I'm thinking about those VHS cassettes that someone thought they needed to keep. You know, the kids that were using stencils to make flyers for free in their parents' basement in 1982 kind of thing. Those are important pieces to understand, like the motives behind the agents and the actors in any kind of cultural formation, whether it's punk music or it's like zines, all of these underground movements.
In a shoebox, inside the box, there are 20, maybe 25 cassette tapes that belonged to my father. He's gone now, and this is what we have left. What remains? On first inspection, the tapes are exactly what I thought they'd be. My dad played folk music and wrote songs just around the house and for friends, and he made simple, pretty amateur recordings. In fact, my obsession with audio started way back then when I was a little kid and I'd hang around in his woodworking shop where he also kept a 4-track cassette recorder and a Radio Shack microphone. I learned how to track harmonies there when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. So I thought I knew what would be on those tapes. Songs I'd forgotten but would still know by heart. My dad's voice and the sound of his guitar, that sound that was the ubiquitous soundtrack of our childhood. But what I actually find, when I finally slipped the first cassette into the little Sony tape player that was also in the box, is so much more puzzling.
Okay, we're in Virginia now, and we're 5, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4. In Virginia. 5, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4. Real pretty here. Okay, crossing into Maryland, and the odometer reading is 7665. 7665.
What I think we would call voice memos today, mixed in with these sort of poetic one-liners.
I don't want to break anybody's heart but my own.
My own voice as a little kid singing along with him. I think that's also a visiting family friend playing the saw on that track, bizarrely. The sound of me as a 14 or 15-year-old interviewing my grandfather about his life.
What does the American dream mean to you?
Keep your health, and I was happy in the business I was in. Lately, 32 years. Worked 6 days a week, and I was happy with what I was doing.
I don't know why my father has this recording or what it was for. I become obsessed with this one piece of tape, which is just the sound of typing. And after a long while, a phone rings.
Hello? Hi. Good. No, it's been pouring rain all day.
For some reason, this is the clip that breaks me. I spend 4 days digitizing the tapes. I send clips and frantic messages to my sister who's 1,000 miles away. I don't leave the house for days. It feels like a trick, like he's here again. But I know he's not. He died of acute myeloid leukemia 12 years ago. And then I find this.
I was a runner for the underground as far as ammunition concerned. But it was plastic ammunition that they used to cut the railroad poles off and all that kind of stuff. When we had all the air attacks and stuff like that, that was a good time for me to run with my ammunition, but it was curfew then. So if you were the right type, they shot you. So having all the Waffen SS guys and everything around, I just put the swastika band on. And I said, Heil Hitler, and they just laughed at me like, okay, you get...
From what I can piece together from the damaged tape, this is my father interviewing a man who was part of the resistance in Norway, maybe, during World War II.
But it's nothing to it. You do the same thing. I mean, don't misunderstand me. We're no heroes. It's just that we hated the German occupation so much.
I have no idea who it is. I call my mother. She doesn't know either. Suddenly, this isn't about me or my family anymore. This is something else. It's someone else's story. And I feel the burden of this tape, like I have to take care of it because it belongs to someone else. That's when I decide I need to learn a whole lot more about the archive.
So my name is Heather Holm, and I'm a private records and public service archivist here at Queen's Archives. Although it is an institutional archives and we have institutional record, I deal with the donation of private papers from individuals. And here at the university, that tends to be family papers, artists, authors, that sort of thing.
Ooh, it's so cold and dark. Okay, so where are we standing?
We are in the third floor vault, which is mostly our audio-visual. These are all of our audio recordings. A number of rows here are photographs. So all behind you, these are all negatives or photographs. Maps, architectural drawings, folio, which is large oversized material that doesn't sort of fit nicely in a box, is down at that end, as well as moving image.
So tell me just like what's going on in the environment here?
In the environment, we maintain, and I am not the conservator or the preservation tech, so I can't tell you exactly, but we do humidity and temperature control readings in the vaults twice a week to make sure that we're maintaining the correct temperature for the material, just like anything else really. Like the warmer, the moister, the more things decompose, so everything is decomposing all the time, so we try and slow down that process and create sort of microclimates. So all of these are acid-free boxes or lignin-free, or with the photographs there's like special pH envelopes that things are in to try and contain any of that off-gassing. And then everything is like, we came in, it was dark, because light is also not a friend to paper or photographs. So they live in, even when we're in here now with the lights on, all these boxes are pretty much closed, so they're not being exposed to light. So yeah, it's dark, cold, and dry.
Yeah, so let's say that I come to you with a box of papers and cassette tapes.
Yeah.
That I want to give to the archive, and you deem them very significant. What's the kind of, I mean, just like you said, you're not a conservator, but like, what is the basic process? What would happen to that box of stuff?
That box of stuff, we would take a look at it. We would do appraisal and selection if that needed to be done. Material would be put into acid-free file folders, acid-free boxes. It would be listed. There would be description done of that. We sometimes do, like all of this, a lot of this audio actually relates to paper. So if we're doing a rewind project where you have to rewind tape every once in a while, 10 years is about our, well, this one I think it's probably 20 years at this point, where you just rewind the tape. Right? But we want to know then where all the tape is. It is all together in the description, but it might physically live in a whole bunch of different places because of its different needs or concerns. And this vault is actually a little bit colder than our other vaults, which is why we have a lot of the AV stuff in here, because it likes it a little bit colder.
Sorry for obsessing over cassettes. But
no, that's okay.
You rewind them just so that the tape is on the other side every now and then?
Yeah, you will get bleed through over time.
So if the tape just sits wound for so long the same way,
yep,
you get bleed through.
Yeah. Magnetic media, which is tape, they have a lifespan that they're just really starting to deteriorate at a certain point. We just did a bunch of our 3/4 inch U-matics, which are these. So it's like a video cassette, but it's big.
Yeah,
right?
I've never seen these. Okay.
Yeah, so these are 3/4 inch U-matics. This was more of a production standard. This material is actually not that old, relatively speaking. But it is, we needed to deal with it because the equipment actually to play these on, because this was also production value, you can't find that many 3/4 inch U-matics, and the tape itself is just disintegrating.
Yeah.
So, but it's also hard to convince people that like our biggest preservation concern is only 15 years old or 20 years old.
Right.
It's not our our Italian Latinate scrolls from 1490 or whatever. Those are beautiful. They're fine.
Well, it's interesting to think that possibly newer technologies might be actually more difficult to preserve.
They are. As we start to move into magnetic, actually, like old negatives, film, you still basically need a light source and a human eye and paper, and you can access it. The more layers you start putting in, like software, like hardware, then the more difficult it is, and especially with a lot of that software and hardware being proprietary, it's harder and harder.
20th century Algerian French philosopher Jacques Derrida wrote about what he calls archive fever, a kind of compulsion, a quote, irrepressible desire to return to the origin, a homesickness. Maybe that's the thing I feel when I hear my father's voice again. Homesickness.
Home is pretty much where you are at the moment. Every place you are at that moment, it's your birthplace and the place of your burial.
My father's recordings have deteriorated because I couldn't bear to listen, even look at them for so long. Parts of them will never be recovered. It's a double loss. But Derrida makes another point that's central to understanding the institutional archive. The word archive comes from the Greek word that literally means the residence of those who command. The archive is a structure. Cameroonian theorist Achille Mbembe says the archive is both the building itself and the documents stored there, and that, quote, in any given cultural system, only some documents fulfill the criteria of archivability. Robert Reed Farr at Harvard says there is a, quote, intimate connection between systemic forms of violence and the methods by which we choose what is archivable.
There's a bunch of different ways to describe the archive. I would say that what is it now, or what was it before? It's a way of controlling information, storing information, and utilizing information. In the Colonial Project, that was about administrating colonies and sort of far off places. In this moment, in the moment of data saturation, the archive becomes a way to make sense of the world, a place to go to try to understand how we got to this moment, what this moment involves, what it doesn't involve, what conversations are possible, what conversations are not possible, what's sayable in a regime. The archive really becomes a mechanism of reproducing the status quo.
Mark Campbell is an assistant professor of music and culture at the University of Toronto. As a scholar, curator, and DJ, he's embedded in the Toronto hip-hop scene and is currently running a major research project on hip-hop archives in Canada. I caught up with him when he visited Queen's University as a guest lecturer last fall.
It's an important place to study the seams of society, how it gets stitched together and how it makes sense. You know, like patriarchy makes sense when you go into the archive because no women are there and only the most important people get into the archive, right? So if you go into the City of Toronto archives, there's no evidence that hip hop ever existed in the City of Toronto. Now, so that kind of erasure is about producing a particular kind of citizen whose comportment and behavior helps replicate the systems that continue to make life miserable for all that aren't part of the dominant culture. So it's really that kind of conversation is why like bricks and mortar archives are they're still important, but they are under serious intellectual inquiry and artistic interrogation today, and should be for that reason. So having to think about the moment at which these archives emerge and think about what tools are there to produce a different kind of non-violent colonial experience in the archive. And that's kind of where the moment that, you know, at least my academic thinking is at this moment.
So like, tell me a little bit about what kind of ideal are you working with to build an archive as far as representing Canadian hip hop?
It's all stimulated by on-the-ground relations. So when someone is willing to let us digitize their collection, or when they find that there's stuff they want preserved, that determines how we go about organizing that material. So your question is really about my method. Yeah, and the method is about engaging the community as to what's important to them, engaging them in terms of saying, hey, here's what other communities are doing around hip hop. Here's an opportunity if you want to do this here in Canada. And it is about finding ways to humanize the content that they put in and they decide to preserve, and finding the balance between humanizing it and the kind of standard cataloging procedures that one would need to make it an archive in the sense that it can read across a bunch of different institutions. So the method is really trying to find a humanistic way to remix the archive.
Is it a recuperative process that you're doing? Do you see yourself as like filling a gap? And what's the story? Like, why? What does it mean? How does it help us?
I think we see ourselves as just providing a service to a community of people that we value. And that service is that we want to make sure that what you've done and how you've contributed to the culture gets celebrated, gets circulated, and gets preserved. Older discourses around archiving is about the best and the quality and this and that, and that's an old model. And it really, even in 2010 and 2008 and 2009, when this was rumored, the beginnings of Northside was starting, it was still about, well, that hip hop's really not that good, so why do you want to preserve it, kind of thing. And you can't really talk about the development of a genre or a community if you don't have the bad or the early or the unpopular or so it really is about trying to make sense of all of the things that get rejected, in a sense, like the things that we don't think are important. So college radio, people think because it's not commercial radio that it's not. It's actually more important to the development of genres of music than commercial radio. Commercial radio doesn't help develop musics, but college radio does. And usually because the production value wasn't as high, people kind of dismiss it. And kind of the work that we do, I mean, I was on radio for 17 years or something like that. trying to understand how you can't really talk about the development of the genre unless you archivally go through what were people doing 10 years ago, and what did it sound like, and what did it take, you know? You can only do that when you spend time with old stuff that seems like it's not that important. One of the things we had on Northside in the earliest iterations is we just had business cards of record stores that went out of business in Montreal. And you think about the community of independent record stores that would, you know, they'd welcome producers, they'd welcome DJs, they'd have a relationship with the buying public, etc. Those folks are also responsible for the development of the musical genre, and they've disappeared, like they've gone out of business a long time ago. Those are the kinds of folks that, you know, we stumbled upon a collection from someone in Montreal, and all he did was collect business cards of these record stores that are no longer, and black businesses that were no longer operating.
Dr. Campbell imagines how the culture and creative methods of hip-hop, like remix, for example, could inform archival practice. He asks, how might theories of the archive and archivization be influenced by hip-hop's disobedience to form? But there are institutional archives all over the globe, and of course, there's still some really important and interesting work happening in them.
You know, it was probably like a dream archival experience. So some days you'd be sitting at a desk, and then out of nowhere, the archivist would ask you if you were like maybe interested in a poster of this performing arts group. And, you know, it's not very popular and most people aren't interested in them, but she would bring them up to you, you know, in case you just wanted to see it, and like very apologetic. And it would just, you know, be this incredible artifact. My name is Kristin Moriah, and I'm an assistant professor of African American literature and culture in the English department here at Queen's University. You know, my encounter with the archives began in graduate school. And so around the time that I was starting my dissertation proposal, there was a huge institutional push at the CUNY Graduate Center to get students to do archival research. With an understanding that sort of no matter what your discipline, that would lead you to sort of new and unique sort of findings within your field. And at the same time, my dissertation advisor also received notification about a research opportunity in Berlin. And I got this fellowship to go to Berlin, and I had more money that I had to live on in Brooklyn, and I, you know, had a lot of time on my hands. And so it was like a fantasy. It's still a fantasy. And when I was at the Free University of Berlin, I met another Canadian scholar, which was exciting to me because I had been living in New York for a while. And her name is Christine Bold, and she also works in performance studies and theater. And we both figured out that there is a City Museum of Berlin that has an incredible set of performing arts archives. And so I spent a lot of time at the City Museum of Berlin, sort of going through just totally random things.
What does this look like? So you're sitting at a desk in the museum, and did someone bring you a box, or what's around you?
So it's funny because the Stad Bibliothek Museum is literally on the edge of the city. So you take a bus for a very, very long time. There's nothing else around. It's it's like an industrial park. There's the canal. There's a very, very sad kind of cafe hooked up to this grocery store. And yeah, it's just you basically in this very sort of clean white office space at a big, big desk. You are working one-on-one with an archivist. So before you go there, you really sort of email ahead. I got the archivist, that was comfortable speaking in English and excited to talk to foreign researchers. And you explain what your research is and which kind of materials you're looking for. And they can help you pinpoint them in that way. And so the most magical moments, I would say, really happened at those times in which the archivist just, after you had been working there for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, really gets a sense of what you're interested in and would sort of pull up these things and sort of remember that they had something maybe that wasn't properly cataloged or that you hadn't necessarily intended to look at, but would still be quite fascinating.
So it's like a relationship you develop with someone, kind of
You really do, yeah. I mean, I think that is probably true for most archives. right? And it helps if you have somebody who can think sort of creatively too, right, about the material that's there.
Mm-hmm. It's just kind of interesting because when I was visiting the archives yesterday, we went into the vault. Like, it's such a literally cold, but also kind of just this cold and like lifeless environment.
Yeah.
Hopefully, if you're trying to preserve something
outside of the freezers that they use to kill the bugs.
Exactly, but like it sounds like it's actually such a human process. Like there is a human mediator with these objects that has to go retrieve them for you to read. It's just something interesting for me to think about.
I was thinking about the human element of the archives when I spoke with archivist Heather Home as well.
So do archives have kind of like a brand? Like, is there a certain story you're responsible to tell?
No, I don't. There's not a particular story that we're responsible to tell. I wouldn't even say that it's our responsibility to tell them. It's our responsibility to make them available for others to tell, for others to access, and for others to use. We're not historians. We're not meant to like collect and then write on and then, sort of disseminate. What we're interested in is acquiring good record and then making that available, describing and making it available for others to use. I mean, if there's any kind of underlying message of archives, it's about accountability. There's a responsibility to maintain the record of how people were governed, like within the institutional, like what things affected those individuals. And so there is a sort of an accountability and transparency vein that runs through, I would say, all of archives.
I'm thinking about this idea of accountability when I read Cheryl Thompson's article, Searching for Black Voices in Canada's Archives, where she describes finding few archivists and librarians who could assist her research in African Canadian collections. Sometimes she was just handed manila envelopes marked Black History that were not sorted, cataloged, or filed.
I think that her experiences are really common, both in Canada and the US, quite frankly. And it ties back into this issue of what it means to have to develop a relationship with an archivist and the sort of the challenges that can stem from that. So if you're working with archivists who don't have a background in things like Black studies that, to me have really emphasized that Black life is everywhere, right? It proliferates, it's often hidden, it's erased, but I genuinely believe that it sort of, it touches all corners. If you don't work with archivists who have that understanding and that sort of curiosity about where Black life and sort of Black politics might be hidden in their spaces, then it becomes very easy for somebody from a different sort of scholarly background to say we don't have any material that's going to relate to that. But that idea that we don't have material that's going to relate to Black studies or Black people has happened to me everywhere. I think it's just a default position often to say, well, this isn't really a space where we think that there are a lot of Black people and thus there won't be a lot of material related to Black people. And it almost never works like that. And for me, it points to one of the urgencies of fields like ethnic studies and Black studies in particular, that we need to have people sort of working at all levels who understand that those traces of Black life aren't necessarily just limited to people we may think of as being part of certain ethnic groups or backgrounds, right? That it can kind of seep out.
Yeah, the sort of ideas around social justice and why don't, where those records might be or how those records might be used. Yes, it is talked about. It's not always possible, though, to rectify, right? To sort of purposely go back. The material isn't there, and so it is about sort of moving forward. And it is that idea of working with communities in order to try and acquire something that may have been missed. But there are also ways of just sort of the record that's here. There's a lot of different ways to just actually approach that record, right? To look at it differently, to ask different questions of it, and reading gaps and reading silences in order to tell a story.
It's an issue for so many scholars I know on a fundamental level, and I think that it's something that people have to sort of cope with in their own way, right? This understanding that those problems will not actually necessarily be solved. I grapple with this too, right? This need to know, this want to have access to, a large body of information, to be sort of inquisitive about it. And that's, I think, a particularly Western ideal, Western humanist ideal that might not serve everybody equally. So, I don't think that it's possible to fix the archive at all. As much as I love the archive, as much as I understand how important the material that we find there can be in terms of understanding our present through the lens of our past, I think that it's unreconcilable, I think.
I would say that, having a praxis that's intentionally anti-colonial and trying to think about what the operation of emancipatory politics would look like every day, it means, to me, valuing the people that aren't the celebrities. It means working in collaboration even if you don't get credit for it. And it means thinking about destroying and rebuilding institutions that are hallmarks of colonialism and wrestling with it. Being okay with wrestling with something for years on end if you feel like you can transform its politics, or at least its discursive strength.
How do you think you can achieve the American dream?
By working hard and have some enthusiasm, aggressiveness if you want to get a job.
Around the time that my father was sick and dying, my sister made a film piece called What Remains as part of her master's thesis. I find it fascinating that a decade later, I end up with this same question while I'm working on my own master's. Except for me, it's about audio, as it always is. Yes, I'm still obsessed with the recording process, thanks to those early experiences in my dad's makeshift studio right next to our chicken coop.
Don't come in and be quiet. We're doing our final take thing.
So what does remain? A pile of magnetic tape that is rapidly breaking down. Now a hard drive full of digitized files, utterly immaterial, saved in the cloud. Will I listen back now that they are just a mouse click away? Why do I feel drawn to the messy noise of the damaged tape, maybe even more than the preserved recordings? And how come I get to carry all this around?
One of our collections here is Isabelle McLaughlin, who's was a 20th century artist, but she's also the daughter of McLaughlin Hall, Adelaide Hall, the daughter of GM, and she had 2 apartments, one for stuff and one to live in, right? There is a privilege that allows you to keep a lot of material, and then I think of Syrian immigration here. People are not arriving with an awful lot of stuff, and especially if they're not arriving with it, they are no way sort of really interested in giving it away, the small, sort of amount. So how things end up in here.
Will my siblings listen to this episode? Will my mother? Will it hurt them? And what about that mystery voice? The man with the World War II story.
They had an awful fight, and then they come back and they burned all Norway down to here.
They burned? You mean they burned the villages?
Everything. They
Why?
burned everything because they were mad.
Will the internet hive brain help me find him? Will I want it to? How do I care for this archive now? And what does all this tell me about my work as a scholar? Can I trust the institutional archives? Can I or we or anyone repair the damage done there? Is this podcast an archive now? Do I want it to be? What responsibility do I have to the voices here? What remains? The sound of my father typing. The sound of him answering the phone.
Hello?
The sound of him talking about the weather.
It's been pouring rain all day today. Yeah.
What remains?
5921, back into Illinois, heading towards Wisconsin.
If you miss the train I'm on, you will know that I'm gone. You can hear the whistle blow 500 miles, 500 miles, 500 miles, 500 miles. You can hear the whistle blow 500 miles.
This has been Hyacinth Podcast, Into the Archive. Big thanks to my guests, Heather Home, Dr. Mark Campbell, and Dr. Kristin Moriah. To learn more about Mark Campbell's Northside Hip Hop Archive, visit nshharchive.ca. For references to all the books and articles I mentioned in this episode, visit hyacinthpodcast.com, where you can also sign up for my One Beautiful Idea monthly newsletter. I want to send out extra thanks to Dr. Kristin Moriah, whose class, which I took from her last fall at Queen's University, heavily informed the research and the reading and the concepts in this episode. Thank you for the work you do, Dr. Moriah. Follow at Hyacinth Podcast on social media and subscribe to Hyacinth Podcast on your favorite app. Ratings and reviews are really helpful to independent podcasts like mine. So if you have a second, and if you feel inclined, please let everyone know what you think of this show. Thank you for coming along on the particularly personal journey of this episode. I'm Carmel Michael. Thank you for listening, and talk real soon.
The train I'm on, you're gonna know that I am gone. You can hear that